So we have Lee Strobel here, who I think is giving a very compelling, not only personal story, but the display of the historical data that can, in a confident way, point to Jesus actually resurrecting. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
Oh, golly. I always look at the affirmative side, which is what is the evidence that Christianity is true? What is the evidence that Jesus is who he claimed to be? I want to make that case because, you can get into arguments about, okay, let's contrast Islam and Christianity and things like that. But ultimately, I think, as someone who started as an atheist, trained in journalism and law, I was looking for what is the evidence? What's the corroboration? How do I know this is true? So if Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, as I mentioned earlier, he did clearly, how do I know he proved it? By returning from the dead. What is the evidence historically that Jesus really returned from the dead? Because if that is true, then he is who he claimed to be, and I ought to put my chips in that pot, right? I ought to go all in Christianity.
And what was that moment for you? Because, if you don't mind sharing your own testimony,
Sure.
because your wife came to you and you guys have been together since you were 18, 9 years old. I think it's good for the audience to hear from you.
Yeah. I mean, I met my wife when we were 14, got married at 19 and 20, and I was an atheist. I lived a very immoral, drunken, profane, narcissistic, self-destructive, in many ways, kind of life. I was successful, went to Yale Law School, was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune, won major awards for investigative reporting. So people would look at that and think, oh man, this guy's got it together. They didn't see the other side. I was literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night. And my wife comes up to me one day and gives me the worst news any atheist husband could get. She said, I've decided to become a Christian. And honestly, first word through my mind, divorce. I was going to
Really?
Oh, yeah, I was going to walk. I didn't want to be married to a Christian.
Now, were both of you guys married? You were atheists, both of you?
No, she was agnostic.
Okay.
She didn't know what to believe. She's kind of spiritual neutral. She meets a neighbor who is a Christian nurse, shares Jesus with her.
Outside of all the historical facts and data that we can talk about, I think I've always thought it was just so mesmerizing how agnostics or atheists can make a complete shift and believe what they believe. Just a side note.
Brings her to church, and she checks things out herself and comes and gives me the news that she's become a Christian. And I thought, what's going to happen? She's going to turn into some holier-than-thou person who's going to look down on me and my drinking, and she wouldn't like my friends anymore, and it's just going to be trouble. How are we going to make decisions about how we spend our money and how we spend our time? We're going to have this divide in our marriage. So I thought, I'm just going to walk out. But then I thought, wait a minute. What if I could rescue her from this cult that she's gotten involved in? How would I do that? Oh, I know. All I got to do is disprove the resurrection of Jesus. Because Jesus clearly, as I said earlier, made messianic divine claims about himself. And the resurrection proved, supposedly, that he is who he claimed to be. So I thought, you know what, give me a long weekend.
So he was so against it that he was so ready to disprove it, which led him along this trajectory. Fascinating.
And I can disprove the resurrection. Dead people don't come back to life. That just doesn't happen. So I thought, I'm trained in this stuff. I can investigate the evidence. So I started to do that. And I used my journalism training, my legal training. It took me 2 years to delve into the minutia of the historical data concerning the death and resurrection of Jesus until November the 8th of 1981. And I said to myself, I've been doing this 2 years. The evidence is in. A good jury reaches a verdict. So I got all the data I gathered. Back then, this is before the internet, so it's a microfilm.
No ChatGPT, no language learning models, no Google.
No Google, no.
So you're going to the library to do this?
Oh, yeah. I remember once I requested an interlibrary loan at the Chicago Library because I was trying to find this obscure book written by one of the founders of Harvard Law School who had become a Christian in the 1800s or whatever. And 6 months later, I get a phone call. We found your book. Wow. That's what it took. I mean, that's why it took me 2 years.
Talk about investigative journalism.
I delved into this stuff and into microfilm and libraries and museums and so forth, interviewing scholars and experts until November the 8th of 81, when I realized any good juror reaches a verdict. And the evidence was in, I need to reach a verdict. And I looked at the data concerning the resurrection. It is fascinating how much that. I'll tell you a little story. There was a guy named Sir Lionel Luckhoo. Sir Lionel is the most successful defense attorney in the world. He was in the Guinness Book of World Records. Why? Because he won 245 murder trials in a row.
This guy right here?
That's him.
Okay.
245 murder trials in a row. Nobody's ever done that. As a defense attorney, either before the jury or on appeal.
Okay.
And when I was a student at Yale Law School, he was my hero because I figured this guy must understand evidence.
He's an atheist.
He was a skeptic about the resurrection. Didn't believe the resurrection occurred. And I was an atheist, so I agreed with him. And he was knighted twice by Queen Elizabeth. He became a member of the Supreme Court of his country. Yeah. So brilliant guy. But he didn't believe in the resurrection. Till somebody came to him one day and said, Sir Lionel, you're the greatest lawyer in the world. Have you ever taken your monumental legal skill and applied it to the historical record of the resurrection and come to an informed verdict on whether Jesus rose from the dead? He said, no, I haven't, but I will. So he spent years doing what I ended up doing, investigating the evidence. And I'll recite to you one sentence he wrote that summarized his conclusion. He says, I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt.
And that's not coming from just no ordinary person. That's coming from the attorney who had won over 200 cases, a defense attorney who had won over 200 cases in a row. This is fascinating.
This from the greatest legal mind, I think, in practical sense, in history. By the way, I told that story in California. I moved to California in the year 2000 to be a teaching pastor at a church. And a woman came up to me afterwards. She said, hey, I'm your new neighbor. We haven't met yet, but you just bought a house down the block. I said, oh, that's great. Good to meet you. She said, yeah, one other thing. I said, what? She said, I'm Sir Lionel's sister.
Stop.
Yes. And we
Your neighbor is his sister.
Yeah,
was she a devout Christian at that time?
Oh, yeah. And she actually showed me his private papers where he had done his investigation. I know. Can you believe that? What are the odds?
What did you find when you're going through it?
It was ultimately a confirmation of what I discovered in my investigation. Can I summarize the evidence for you real quick? 4 words that begin with the letter E to summarize the evidence for the resurrection. This is what brought me from atheism to faith. The first E stands for execution, that Jesus was truly dead after being crucified. Okay. There is no record anywhere of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. In fact, this is not controversial among even atheist scholars, because when you study ancient history, we're lucky if we have one good source to confirm a fact, or maybe 2 good sources. So if you have Alexander the Great, and we believe certain things about his life, well, dig down. How do we know? Well, it turns out it's 1 source, maybe 2 sources. And yet for the death of Jesus, we not only have multiple sources in the documents of the New Testament, we got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible confirming his execution. This is so well established of an historical fact, you could get laughed out of a major academic institution if you go in and claim he somehow survived the crucifixion. In fact, get this. No less of a source in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, peer-reviewed medical scientific journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And this was their conclusion, quote, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. Even the atheist historian, Gerhard Ludemann, says it's indisputable that Jesus was dead. First E, execution, he's dead. Second E, early accounts. In other words, we have early reports that come very quickly after the crucifixion that he rose from the dead. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that the resurrection was a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. So I figured 100, 150, 200 years after the life of Jesus, legends were invented, and that's where the idea came from. Guess what? We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest church. The first Christians had a creedal statement based on facts that they knew to be true, based on eyewitness accounts that summarized their convictions. And it said Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the 3rd day, he rose again. And then it has the specific names of individuals and groups of people who encountered the resurrected Jesus, including 500 people at once. Well, guess what? Historians have been able to date that creed. So, for instance, one of the great historians, James D.G. Dunn of England, one of the greatest historians of our time, dated that creed. And he says we can be entirely confident that that creed was formulated within months of the death of Jesus. Within months. That's historical gold. That's far too quick to be a legend. The great historian A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford and Cambridge said the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So we got a news flash, and it's not the only early report we got. We got others in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts. all that date back so early they were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries who would have disputed the claims if they had been wrong. So that's the second E, is early accounts. The third E stands for empty. We have an empty tomb. And what's interesting about that is even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. Everybody conceded the tomb was empty. How do we know? Because we know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the enemies of Jesus said was, the disciples stole the body. Now think about that. They're conceding the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. So everybody's conceding the tomb is empty. That's not the issue of history. It is, the issue of history really is, how did it get empty? Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. Religious leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. The disciples weren't about to steal the body. I found 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that said that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. They were willing to die for it. Why? Because they heard in Sunday school he'd risen from the dead and proved he's the Son of God? No, because they were there. Of all human beings who've ever lived, they were in a position to know for a fact whether he returned from the dead or not. They touched him, they talked with him, they ate with him. And knowing the truth, they were even willing to die for it. Then finally, the fourth E stands for the word eyewitnesses. Remember I said earlier, we're lucky in ancient history. If we have a fact we believe to be true, we dig down, we find one source, maybe 2 sources. There are 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. That is an avalanche of historical data. And so it was based on that kind of evidence that I sat as an atheist and said, wait a minute, if I'm going to be honest, if I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it points, which is what I was always taught to do, then I have to conclude that Jesus didn't just claim to be God. He backed up that claim by returning from the dead.
Now,
How fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. My thoughts on it, is the conversation necessary? The conversation is incredibly necessary because it's history. I think we all should be skeptics of anything, right? That's how we go on to know if something is true or not. And if something is making the claim as big as a claim as a person rising from the dead and being God himself as a man, it's incredibly understandable to be a skeptic of that. The fact that we are skeptics of it pushes us to learn more about it. And history is so necessary so that we can know whether things are true or not. And the historical data around this, you can't deny it, right? Like even when he said about atheist scholars all agreeing that Jesus had died, also that the tomb was empty. If you're ignoring all that historical data, you're just intentionally ignoring history. And if you decide to, in my opinion, if you decide to do that, you're just not on a true quest. Let's just respect his history for what it is. And those historical facts are, in my opinion, overwhelming. And it's incredible to see how an ex-atheist who was trying to convince his wife that no, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. This is all a joke. This is all fairy tales. And he had the prerequisites to study this type of stuff. And he ended up finding that there was so much evidence that you would almost be silly to think of anything other than Jesus actually resurrecting. It's incredibly fascinating. I think that anybody should have any form of healthy skepticism, and you should pursue it. You should go on to research these things. And I think once you get to that doorstep, you're going to be faced with a decision to make. Where are you going to put your faith at? Are you going to put your faith in going against what the evidence points to or what it leads to? Or are you going to put your faith in what the quite obvious is? Right? Absolutely fascinating. And I think more importantly, it's the personal change that happens in a person's life after they accept Jesus. It's the personal change. He was an atheist. He was living a drunken life. He had no intuitive purpose in his eyes. He had accomplished all these things, but it meant nothing without a true source of purpose. And that is that is what I like to share as well too in my own personal life, things that have happened. So I would love to know what you guys think. Leave your comments below and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you.